I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we assess reports of Russian progress in Donetsk, hear live from Tbilisi as protesters crowd the streets following the weekend's contested election, and hear from our correspondent who is on the ground at the BRICS summit in Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 29th of October, 2 years and 254 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell, our man on the Moscow desk James Kilner, who will be sharing his reflections from Kazan, and dialing in from Tbilisi, Georgia, Nate Ostiller, editor of OC Media, which covers the North and South Caucasus. I began, however, with the latest news from the battlefield. Let's start in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, where Moscow's forces are now confirmed to have advanced closer to the key logistics hub of Pokrovsk. Several hours ago, Russia's defence ministry claimed its forces have captured the eastern Ukrainian town of Seledo, a frontline settlement about 18 km southeast of Pokrovsk. As a result of successful operations, they declared, the town is fully liberated. That announcement came shortly after Moscow claimed the capture of two nearby villages, Bogiavlenka and Katerlinivka, and the small town of Gyansk, which are all located south of Seledo and near the Ukrainian-held industrial town of Korokhove. Seledo had around 20,000 inhabitants before Russia launched its offensive. Nobody knows how many are there now. It had the only coal mine in Donetsk that remained under Ukrainian control, and it continued operating from there despite its frontline location, providing an important resource for Ukraine. Its loss will, some speculate, be felt. Now, the Kyiv Post has compiled the best overall picture of the situation there, reporting that Russian armour and infantry backed by artillery and aircraft was operating under near total air superiority, moving freely around the centre, etc. in the past day or so, with geolocated drone and ground imagery suggesting Moscow's forces have taken control of the high-rise residential district, which is quite tactically important. They report how one Ukrainian army lieutenant wrote in a Telegram post yesterday, regarding Seledo and the village of Vishnivi, the situation is far from the best. The Russians are trying to storm the houses in a residential sector of the latter. They've advanced along the railway, and unfortunately they are succeeding. The vast majority of the village is already under enemy control, maybe even completely. The village has simply been flattened. The commander of a Ukrainian company operating near Seledo stated Russian forces can afford to deploy 600 troops per week to infantry assaults, and that Russian forces continue to have enough reserve forces to constantly conduct assaults in the area. A spokesperson also stated Moscow forces are conducting artillery strikes less frequently, preferring to conduct precise strikes with FPV drones attached to and then dropped from reconnaissance drones. Now, it is that area of the Donbass where most attention should be paid over the next few days. In Luhansk, Russian forces recently marginally advanced southeast of Kupiansk amid ongoing offensive operations. Elsewhere, though, fighting continues in the main Ukrainian salient in Kursk, but according to the ISW and others, there were no confirmed changes to the front line. Likewise, on the Kharkiv axis, Russian forces continued limited offensive operations northeast of Kharkiv city near Vovchansk, but didn't advance. It is worth stressing that whilst there have been no huge breakthroughs for the Russians as such, in October, the Russian army took 478 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory incrementally, a record since the first weeks of the conflict in March 2022. In the aerial war, overnight in Kyiv, Russian drone debris injured 6, causing a minor fire, and shrapnel also breaking windows in an administrative building there. 4 were killed on a strike in the district of Kharkiv, and in Kryvyi in central Ukraine, a Russian missile strike injured 14 and led to the death of one 39-year-old man. Multiple buildings and a gas pipeline were also allegedly hit there, but the fire has now been extinguished. Ukrainian forces continue to conduct drone strikes against Russian distilleries, reportedly to reduce Russian aviation capabilities. As Dom spoke about last week, they produce rocket fuel and fuel for aviation brake systems and technical needs, anti-icing agents, etc. It's not for alcohol in the sense that most of us know. But even so, an interesting development that those are continuing and speaks to the wider strategy that Kyiv is conducting at the moment, I think. Now, on to the big subject of the past couple of weeks, North Korea. And senior Ukrainian forces have now told the Financial Times that about 3,000 North Korean troops have been secretly transported in civilian trucks from the far east of Russia to Kursk. That confirms the reports that we were just first discussing from the Ukrainian intelligence services at the end of last week. One official there said that only a few hundred of those 3,000 are special forces, the others being regular troops. They were housed on Monday in barracks about 50 k's from the Ukrainian border, where they were awaiting further orders from Russian command. The quoted officials question their quality, their fighting ability. They described the majority as being inexperienced, low-ranking foot soldiers. And to quote them, they have never left their country before. They've never fought in actual combat, and their experience is very far from the reality of modern warfare. Said that the first experience of drones that they'd had were only in the last few weeks, and these officials speculate that the North Koreans are really there to be used, in their phrase, as cannon fodder by the Russians, preserving their own men in those devastating meat grinder assaults. Now, our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes, who's currently seconded to Washington, D.C., has been looking into the implications of North Korean forces' involvement for Western strategy and weapons permissions. He reports for us, citing the Pentagon, that Ukraine will be allowed to fire US-donated weapons at those North Korean troops fighting alongside Russia, with those forces being seen as co-belligerents in the conflict. Sabrina Singh, the spokeswoman for the Pentagon, confirmed intelligence reports that a portion of some 10,000 North Korean soldiers sent for training in Russia have been deployed now closer to the front lines. President Biden said that their deployment was very dangerous yesterday as he cast his vote in the election. Now, Andrei Sybiha, the Ukrainian foreign minister, said Kyiv has been warning about this deployment for weeks, which is true, and accused allies of failing to deliver a strong response. He said the bottom line, listen to Ukraine. The solution, lift restrictions on our long-range strikes against Russia now. So watch this space on that continuingly important story, and one that feels like it's only become more so over the coming days. That's where we are in the military realm, but let's turn to pure politics now in Georgia, where matters are at fever pitch following the contested results of the general election over the weekend. The parties opposing Georgian Dream, which of course has aligned itself more closely to Moscow in recent years, as we spoke about, have said the election was stolen amid widespread reports of voter fraud. We left you yesterday with uncertainty about whether the population of Tbilisi would answer the president's call to come out and protest. Well, to answer that question, let's go now to Nate, who is in Tbilisi and was on the streets last night. Nate, welcome back. It's been a long time. What is the mood in the capital? What happened yesterday?
Thanks for having me again. I think, unfortunately, to answer your question, the answer is still uncertainty. There were a lot of people out last night. I've heard estimates of maybe 100,000. And the mood is not totally doom and gloom, but I think there's still a long way to go before people are expecting a real change, I guess.
Thank you. And comparisons, of course, have been made with Maidan in Ukraine. Roland was talking about this yesterday, where, of course, protests had lasted for months before the pro-Russian head of the country was compelled to leave. Do you see that as being a conceivable outcome in this instance, or is the momentum not really strong enough with anti-government protesters at present?
I would say two things about that. First, it's too soon to say, especially if we were to compare it to Maidan, which did take several months. Yesterday was the first protest of probably a long series. I don't think anyone really wants it to turn into that, especially with the associated violence. But I will add that I had a sense of deja vu last night after going to many, many protests this spring against the foreign agent law. I think one of them was the largest in Georgian history, and we know what happened with that. I mean, the people, at least of Tbilisi and other major cities, showed their opinion about what they thought of the law, and Georgian Dream essentially ignored it and passed it anyway.
Interesting. Now, I should add that there has been a joint statement since yesterday of EU ministers on the election results, signed by the ministers of Czechia, Denmark, Germany, Estonia, Finland, France, Ireland, Lithuania, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, Latvia and Spain. It says, and I quote, "We're deeply concerned about the current situation in Georgia. International observers reported violations during the election campaign as well as on election day. We condemn all violations of international norms for free and fair elections. We share their concerns and demand an impartial inquiry of complaints and remedy of the violations established. We stand in this difficult time at the side of Georgians. It is important that protests and in particular government reaction to them remain peaceful. The violations of electoral integrity are incompatible with the standards expected from a candidate to the European Union. They are a betrayal of the Georgian people's legitimate European aspiration. Upholding the rule of law and free and fair elections is integral to any progress on Georgia's EU path. We criticise the Prime Minister Orban's premature visit to Georgia. He does not speak on behalf of the EU." Now, Nate, Ursula von der Leyen expressed similar sentiments yesterday, saying that the Georgian people have a right to know what happened. On Viktor Orban, we reported yesterday that he had dashed to Georgia to give his seal of approval to the result. How was he received by both the authorities there in Georgia and then also by the crowds who were out last night?
Right. Well, there's been videos I'm sure you've seen of crowds booing him. And actually one Hungarian journalist, I believe, was heckling him in Hungarian as he arrived, actually not far from where the protests were happening. But for Georgian Dream, I think they were thrilled to have him here. He's probably their biggest advocate in Europe, in the EU. And if we look at who else has congratulated Georgian Dream on their victory, it's a pretty small list. Orban, despite what we may think of him and his position on Russia and Ukraine, he is still the head of an EU country, and it means something for Georgian Dream.
Thank you. And just one final question from me. We learned today that all of the major opposition parties have refused to enter the parliament. What are the implications of that? Where do you see the direction of travel going in the coming hours and days?
Right. Well, a similar thing happened in 2020, actually, and they eventually did enter the parliament. So it's hard to say, and I really can't predict what will happen. As far as I can tell, the opposition is doing the right thing by waiting until there are really conclusive results and evidence that they can point to, and not just theories. I think there should be a stronger stance from the EU and especially from the US. I know people were disappointed by Blinken's comments yesterday, but to a certain extent, it really does need to wait until they have a strong case to make, and then we can go from there. But I would say my only guess is that this is far from over and that this could stretch for many months, possibly into next year.
Well, thank you very much, Nate, for that. You're, of course, welcome to stay on until final thoughts at the end. Now, like the Last Supper, we're blessed to have not one, but two Jameses with us today. David would have appreciated that rather niche theology joke. James Rothwell, can I go to you, first of all, in Germany, dialing in to us live? There have been some very interesting developments in the past few days in your patch. Where do you want to start?
Hello, Francis. Thanks very much for having me back on. Well, let's begin in Germany. Very interesting story broke on Friday afternoon. As some of our listeners may have read in the papers on Friday, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, had rather bluntly rejected a key pillar of Volodymyr Zelensky's victory plan, namely his desire to receive a swift invitation to NATO as part of that plan. And I had a very interesting conversation with a NATO source who was, I'll be frank, really quite angered by the remarks that Mr. Scholz had made in this TV interview about the plan. Now, Mr. Scholz had basically said that there was no prospect of Ukraine being allowed into NATO anytime soon. And he also suggested that that was very much the kind of majority view of NATO countries. Now, this is a slightly vexed issue within NATO. Of course, the most supportive allies of Ukraine may not want Ukraine into NATO while it's still at war. But symbolically and politically, the idea that Ukraine is on a pathway to NATO membership is, of course, a really important part of all of this. It gets to the heart of the question of deterring further military incursions by Vladimir Putin into Ukraine, but also in the long term, perhaps even into other NATO states or European countries. So my NATO source said that Mr. Scholz was misguided at best, and he went on to suggest that Mr. Scholz might even be hijacking the Ukrainian issue in order to appease voters at home. As our listeners know, Mr. Scholz is under a lot of political pressure in Germany at the moment, particularly in East Germany, where support for the Kremlin-friendly AfD and BSW, a new left-wing party, is on the rise. And my source in NATO said, it is misguided, this interview by Mr. Scholz. Many allies do see the need for NATO membership as a real deterrent for future Russian misadventures. So in other words, there's a bit of tension at the moment between NATO HQ and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And as you know, Francis, this has been an issue pretty much since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Mr. Scholz constantly coming under criticism for his reluctance to send not just more powerful weaponry to Ukraine, but also coming across in interviews as really not keen at all on the idea that Ukraine might be joining NATO, even in the long term. And another story involving Mr. Scholz, which broke over the weekend in the Telegraph as well, I should add, is a new book which has been published by Norbert Röttgen, a senior foreign policy expert in the CDU party in Germany. The CDU, of course, famously used to be led by Chancellor Angela Merkel. It's now led by Friedrich Merz, who's moved the party in a slightly populist but decidedly pro-Ukrainian direction. And the CDU is quite likely to win next year's elections. And in light of that, Mr. Röttgen has published a book on the challenges internationally facing Germany, which gives quite a good deal of insight into what a CDU policy on Ukraine might look like. He was extremely critical of Chancellor Scholz, Mr. Röttgen was, in this book that the Telegraph has seen. He says that Mr. Scholz, quote, kissed goodbye to the philosophy, politics and historic success of the West's nuclear deterrence during the Cold War when he refused to send more powerful weaponry to Ukraine, citing fears that it could escalate the situation into nuclear war. This has always been a sore subject for some of Mr. Scholz's critics in Europe, that the risk of nuclear war sometimes gets, as it were, wheeled out when the Chancellor is under pressure to provide that stronger weaponry. Lots of sources, of course, in NATO and in Western countries would argue that it is not escalatory to send more powerful weapons to Ukraine. They would cite the example of the British Storm Shadows as evidence of that. And it, I think, speaks to this sort of wider theme, particularly captured by that other story about Mr. Scholz clashing with NATO, which is that there's a concern that the current German government is perhaps appeasing the Russian government at the moment, and it is encouraging other rogue states. It's worth pointing out that Iran continues to seek nuclear weapons, encouraging rogue states to basically bully Berlin with nuclear threats as soon as they run into a kind of contentious or sort of major foreign policy issue. That book is called Democracy and War, and as I said, it's by Norbert Röttgen, a CDU foreign policy expert. And the reason we covered that book, as I said, is because it's got some clues there as to what future CDU policy on Ukraine might look like. Let's now move to Poland, a very interesting development in this long-running saga involving mysterious parcels containing incendiary devices that have been put on planes all over Europe. At least one in East Germany, in Leipzig, and another suspicious parcel was placed on a DHL airfield in Birmingham over the summer. Listeners may recall that these parcels contained incendiary devices. They were put in planes at DHL sites and then they caught fire. Now, the planes had not taken off into the air when the fire occurred, a very good thing, because we're told that these planes would have crashed if the fire had gone out once the plane was actually flying. This is a major security breach in Europe, and British counter-terrorism police are closely investigating it, as are German authorities. There is a suspicion that these incendiary devices were placed in these parcels on planes by Russia as part of its hybrid warfare campaign across Europe. That's the background, but the developments over the past few days is that a Polish newspaper, Wyborcza, has published a very detailed account of further details, if you like, about this rather sinister plot to plant these incendiary devices in parcels in airfields all over Europe. They say that these parcels contained, and I quote from the story, erotic gadgets, which is a perhaps rather unexpected twist in the story. These spontaneously combusting parcels contained electric massage pillows made in China, cosmetics and erotic gadgets. One was sent to Birmingham, one was sent to Leipzig, another one was sent to Warsaw. And this Polish newspaper reports that the origin of these packages was Vilnius, which is very interesting indeed. The Polish security services who investigated that parcel fire in Warsaw are taking this extremely seriously. And there are concerns that this is a major escalation of the Russian hybrid warfare campaign. When we talk about hybrid warfare, we tend to think about things like cyber attacks, attempts to destabilize European democracies, and sabotage attacks as well. But the idea that you would place an incendiary device in a plane, hidden in a parcel, and that might then cause the plane to crash while it's in Europe is obviously a very drastic escalation. As I said, for the time being, Russia is suspected. They haven't yet been, as it were, openly and publicly accused. But we know that hybrid warfare by the Russians has been going on for a very long time. Certainly all the signs at the moment are pointing in that direction. I now want to move to another story, a third story involving Chancellor Olaf Scholz. In fact, he was in India recently, and Mr. Scholz, while in India, has expressed support for a political settlement of Russia's war against Ukraine. And he has expressed support of India's initiative to mediate in this process. That's quite an interesting development, I think, the idea that India may perhaps be interested in playing a mediation role. How effective they might be in such a role perhaps remains to be seen. But Mr. Scholz said that he welcomed India's readiness to, and I quote, use its strong ties with all parties to contribute to a political resolution of the conflict. This sort of ties into the sort of wider theme of this episode as the war seems to expand and involve other parties, including North Korea. On the other side of the equation, perhaps the government of India may be willing to play a role in mediation efforts. And by the way, Roland Oliphant reported recently that Mr. Zelensky actually did an interview with the Times of India yesterday. So there's a suggestion there that perhaps something more significant than just an aspiration towards mediation talks might be going on. There does seem to be some diplomatic activity going on behind the scenes. And then I just want to end with a little comment about sanctions. And I'm going to be, as it were, sort of borrowing from some points that Roland made to us recently. There is a myth at the moment, perhaps, that Russian sanctions don't work. There's a lot of criticism of them. And there's been this suggestion that they are a sort of hollow way of creating deterrence for a rogue state. But we understand that sanctions on Russia have forced the complete halt of commercial operations at a Russian project called Arctic LNG-2. This is according to Timothy Milonov, who's the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, and he reported recently that this project's gas field output has plummeted by over 50% in October 2024. Just some statistics for you. It's gone from generating 12.1 million cubic meters daily, Mr. Milovanov says, to just 5.3 million cubic meters. And Roland was explaining to us that this shows that actually Russian sanctions do have a sort of material impact on the ground. And that's a good example of that. The Arctic LNG-2 facility, where the gas output has massively plummeted. I'll just make one final addition, which is connected to the sanctions issue. And this has come out of the Institute for the Study of War. Vladimir Putin, perhaps not a man for admitting weakness publicly, has acknowledged Russia has an issue with labour shortages as of October 28. And he has suggested that actually it's Russia's low unemployment rates are the real issue for this labour shortage. This is part of a wider picture where the Russian president is trying to put a brave face on an economy that has been hit quite hard in some areas by sanctions. And the fact that Mr. Putin would acknowledge that Russia's having economic issues like labour shortages perhaps is a sign that sanctions, which we sometimes criticise as not being effective, are indeed having an effect behind the scenes. Francis, that's everything on the political developments so far.
Well, thank you, James. And now over to James Kilner. James, this has been a long-awaited visit by you onto our airwaves. And just to fill listeners in, we didn't want to advertise it at the time for obvious reasons. James was actually at the BRICS summit in Kazan last week. We at the time, James, were using your reporting to flesh out what we were talking about as it unfolded. But now that you're back with us, you can provide a insight of somebody actually there on the perspective on its political significance, but also on the mood and the nuances that you can only really gauge from being on the ground. So James, welcome. Great to have you back. Where do you want to start?
Hi, Francis. Yep, I was in Kazan last week in central Russia for this BRICS conference, this BRICS summit that Putin was throwing. It was the first trip to Russia by a Telegraph correspondent since the start of the war in February 2022. So that in itself was a relatively big deal for the newspaper. Lots of hoops to jump through to get it organised, etc. And flying in was always going to be a bit of an unknown. As it turned out, I was the only British newspaper journalist there. The Washington Post was there and the New York Times were there from international media, and a couple of German correspondents, but that was it from the West. I know we've spoken about BRICS a fair amount on this podcast. I've been flagging it up pretty much every opportunity I've been on for the past couple of months. BRICS was a relatively sleepy economic backwater group that was set up by Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa in 2009. And it was staying as a sort of relatively obscure counterweight to the West in some ways until Russia got hold of it and wanted to expand it into some sort of big bang anti-Western group. In January this year, Putin expanded the BRICS group from the five original members. The UAE joined Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, and Saudi Arabia as an observer state. So that was the initial big bang that the Kremlin wanted to create. It wanted to create an anti-Western bloc, counterweight to the West's economic might, etc. Initially did this in January, but it really saw, Francis, this is the whole point about BRICS, it really saw this BRICS summit in Kazan as an opportunity to show the West that Putin and the Kremlin, they had all these friends, they had all these allies, and they're all signing up to BRICS in Russia under the gaze of Vladimir Putin. That was the real point of this exercise. 35 states turned up, including the current BRICS members. And the idea was that Russia and Putin would woo a load of others, and there would be sort of this BRICS big bang. And at the end of the 3-day summit, they could present this new enlarged group. The Kremlin was so confident that this was going to happen that it was briefing journalists in the days beforehand that they were going to get at least 12 on board, possibly 15, etc., that there was going to be a paragraph in the BRICS communique about Ukraine, and that they were on target to start building a BRICS international payment system alternative to SWIFT. SWIFT is the international payment system that Russia was kicked out of after it invaded Ukraine. But really, what this boiled down to was an exercise in looking at the Kremlin's worldview close up at the ground zero and watching a version of the Kafkaesque world building that the Kremlin's very powerful, very adept propaganda machines is up to. It was determined to push its message across as many channels as possible. It had flown in all hundreds. There were just banks of journalists, very pliant state journalists from all around the world had turned up to this event, and they were going to be used by the Kremlin to push its anti-Ukraine, anti-West, pro-Iran, pro-China agenda to every corner of the world. And it was doing this, it was laying on high-quality free food, it laid on travel, the FSB officers, the border guards and the FSB officers at the airport spoke a bit of English, been told to smile. I was pulled away for a brief interrogation about what I was doing there, etc., etc. And I got wished to have a good stay by plainclothes FSB officers as I left, that sort of thing. The Kremlin was really up for this. It really wanted Kazan to be seen as a great, successful project. There were these students on street corners welcoming people to Russia. The public transport system had been geared towards this huge expo center, which was basically 3 massive warehouses on the outskirts of the town by the airport, geared to getting all the journalists there and back in good time, etc. But at the same time, the war in Ukraine was hanging over the whole conference. For example, the 4G internet coverage was terrible because of the drone jamming equipment that the Russian security services were having to employ to stop the threat of Ukrainian drones attacking the airport while all the delegates were there. Only on the eve of the conference, a Ukrainian drone had been heading towards the airport in Kazan, and they had to close the airport temporarily. So the security was really tight. There was loads and loads and loads of security checks, and around the city there were police guys with, bristling with machine guns and body armor, etc., on street corners. So it was a very dystopian view of the Kremlin's sort of effort to build a world where you've got hardcore security, this pretense of plurality and freedom of speech, but actually a very hardcore propaganda machine pressing its messages. One of the Russian opposition news channels got hold of a missive sent by the Kremlin to its own journalists, the Russian media journalists, which told them how to write their stories and told them to refer to Vladimir Putin as the informal leader of the global majority, and instructed them to write how the elites in the Western countries were all panicked by the growing BRICS bloc and how the West was racked with anxiety. So a real interesting insight into what was going on. If you can imagine these three huge hangars side by side, dozens of plainclothes security officers wandering around. At one end, at the furthest end, away from the hub, our journalists, we were kept in like this pen. And if you've ever done any conference style journalism, these sort of journo pens, the media centers, whatever, are very frustrating. We had no contact with any of the delegates unless they formally agreed. You had to get a meeting with a delegate from any country, you had to go through their independent foreign ministry. So they made it as difficult as possible to actually do any real journalism, talk to any delegates. We were just spoon-fed this video feed from this hall, probably 150 meters away, 2 halls over, where Putin was meeting all these leaders with bilateral meetings and roundtable meetings with the whole BRICS thing going on. So we were really spoon-fed what to talk about. At the end of this whole 3-day jamboree, Putin gave a press conference. He's very fond of giving these rather long and rambling press conferences. He was clearly in a relatively good mood, hadn't all gone his way, and I've got to talk about that a little bit later. It hadn't all gone his way, but he was clearly in a good mood. He'd got some great photos of himself shaking hands with leaders from India, Iran, China, Bolivia, West Africa, Egypt. Generally, it'd gone relatively well for him. So he was in a fairly relaxed mood, and he had one of these press conferences, probably for about an hour, 50 minutes. Most of the questions were teed up with clients, Russian, Bolivian, Egyptian, state media, etc. But there was one question from the BBC and one question from NBC. There was also a question from, and this really sums it up, there's also a question from a Kyrgyz human rights activist / journalist. He introduced himself, in which he praised Putin for his humanity and what he'd done for human rights around the world. So a really dystopia vision of the world coming out of the BRICS summit in Kazan last week.
It's so fascinating hearing your perspective there, James. As I say, we've been eager to have you on once you were safely back. I want to ask James about 2 things, if I may. First of all, we were doing a lot of reporting on the attendance of the UN Secretary General. I'm very interested in the perspective of that being there and how surprised perhaps you were and others that he was attending. And then I also just want to ask a little bit more about the, as it were, unsuccessful aspects of the conference from Putin's perspective. But first of all, the UN Secretary General, interested on that, James?
We kind of got wind that he'd probably turn up, but when he did actually turn up, it really was quite a shock. His staff had briefed media that this was, the norm. This is what the UN Secretary General does. He goes to big meetings where leaders are meeting, representing, in the case of BRICS, or at least in the case of this summit, almost 50% of the world's population. So the UN was saying Guterres had to come. This was such an important meeting; he had to be there. But the optics of him being there were seismic in many ways. He was shaking hands with Putin. He was shaking hands with Chinese President Xi, the Iranian president, etc., giving Putin a huge propaganda coup. It really was. And this was particularly noticeable at one particular round table, I think on the morning of the 3rd day, where there were two people that the cameras were concentrating on. All the leaders had their say. They generally addressed Putin. They said, thank you very much for inviting me. I think you've done a wonderful job, this sort of thing. And then Putin would respond, as he was clearly enjoying the limelight. So Putin was obviously the main focus of the TV cameras. But clearly, the second most obvious focus was Guterres. The Russian cameraman had clearly been told to get as many photos, as much video coverage of him being there as possible. He was being used in the Kremlin's own way as a propaganda coup. The next day, across Russian media, across the newspapers, it was him. Guterres did not say anything publicly during his whole stay there, which is also an interesting element. To answer a second question, the success or not of BRICS. So Putin got everyone. He got most of the people he wanted there. That was definitely a success for Putin. This was his biggest moment on the international world stage since the start of the war in February 22. It was designed by the Kremlin to make him look good and to make him look like he had lots of friends, etc. And in many ways, that was achieved. As for BRICS itself, I would say that it was probably underwhelming for the Kremlin. Like I said, the Kremlin had gone to great effort in the run-up to promote it as a BRICS Big Bang. At one stage in the summer, a couple of months ago, they were talking about 35 new members signing up. These are Russian allies from South America, West Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, etc., hooking into what was seen as a pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine, anti-West group. Some of these countries had put out statements saying, yeah, we're thinking of joining. When it came down to it, there didn't seem to be a clear number. There was a note going around saying, 12 or 13 countries have said they might join, but there wasn't any clear new members. And even Putin, at this final press conference, he had to almost admit that no new members had signed up over the course of his summit. He said something along the lines of, we've had lots of interest, we're sending out follow-up communiques to see who's actually going to come through with it. So for me, that was as much an admission from the Russian president that his idea of building a BRICS anti-Western group hadn't quite gone according to plan. For example, on this list of 12 to 13 potential new members that was floating around Telegram and around the conference were Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. I've done a lot of work in my 20-year career as a journalist in Central Asia, and I was able to follow up some leads on this exact issue. I've got a good contact. He's extremely close to the Kazakh government, and he said there's no way that Kazakhstan is going to sign up to BRICS in Russia under Putin's gaze when he and Kremlin officials are posturing about putting in an anti-Ukraine clause in the final communique. He said that would be so damaging to their alliances with the West that they just couldn't do that. Central Asia is a very tricky, uniquely tricky situation. Obviously ex-Soviet, lots of Russian influence, also lots of influence from China, but also very concerned about this war in Ukraine. Kazakhstan shares the longest continuous land border in the world with Russia, and some of the crazy Kremlin propagandists a couple of years ago were talking about Kremlin invading Kazakhstan. So this particular expert said to me, there's no chance this is happening. And by the way, he said, if Kazakhstan's not going through with it, there's no chance any of the other Central Asian countries are going to go through with it. So Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan on this list of potential follow-up members, that's not going to happen. I think we are seeing a pushback against this utopia that Putin wanted, this idea of building a BRICS anti-Western group. And I think it comes down to the Kremlin specifically trying to frame it as anti-Ukraine, anti-West. They did put in a paragraph in the 134-paragraph BRIC communique about Ukraine, but it was very weak. It just said that the member states who were there wanted a peaceful solution, basically. I think in that sense, it probably was a disappointment to the Kremlin. I think they probably tried to push it too far. I think the potential BRIC members are too disparate, and a lot of them are obviously keen at a bilateral level in developing ties with the Kremlin and leveraging all the benefits that come with that, but may not have wanted to sign up to such an overtly anti-Western bloc under Putin's gaze. I think that is the key issue here.
Well, thank you very much, James, for that. So interesting to hear that on-the-ground perspective, and a perfect example, I think, of why it is so important to go onto the ground and hear those perspectives if the opportunity arises to do so. Now, just one final question to you, James. We're hoping to hear your perspective on being in Russia in due course another time, but there's been an interesting story that I know you also covered for the paper, and it's a bit of a lighter one. Some remarkable footage coming out of Moscow yesterday of a huge plume of excrement propelled 10 stories up into the air, coating the streets below. Now, it wasn't pesky Peskov opening his mouth. It was supposedly something to do with a utility fault that may or may not be connected to the story James Rothwell was speaking about earlier on, of there being a manpower shortage in Moscow and other major cities. Just wondered what the facts of this story are, James, because it's been quite widely reported, and what your perspective is on it.
I think that the whole line about the excrement being exploding into the air, I think that was pushed by pro-Ukraine commentators. I think the line that I believe and was reported by reliable Moscow-based Telegram channels, which are fairly neutral in the way they present things, is that this was a gas pipeline that was being cleaned through with heavily pressurized water. I mean, the video showed this sort of brown or yellow sludge firing 10, 12 stories in the air. I mean, incredibly highly pressured, which I'm not sure you get from sewage systems. The line that I believe to be true was that this was Gazprom trying to clean out a new gas pipe to a new residential site which had been built next to where this pipe apparently exploded. I would subscribe to that view. Obviously, I'm not there, so I don't 100% know. Thankfully, I'm not there. Been covered in whatever it is that's been firing up in the air. To your point about manpower shortages and the economic impact, it is huge in Russia. There is no doubt about that. This war in Ukraine has absolutely sucked Russia of manpower. You can read about this all the time, and I think the Kremlin is beginning to worry about it. It's come at the same time as that they're making it more difficult for Central Asians, where they typically pull in their migrants to come to Russia, partly as a result of the terrorist attack and the Crocus Hall concert in Moscow in March, where 4 Tajiks were blamed for shooting dead more than 140 people. So, yes, the economy and the inflation and manpower shortages are hitting Russia hard. Something like 25,000 lifts around Russia are now past their sell-by date and need replacing in these tall apartment blocks, but there's no money to replace them. So the people living in these apartment blocks are going to have to just get on with rickety lifts which don't work all the time. This sort of thing is happening all the time, this sort of infrastructure sort of crack. So we don't 100% know what happened with this pipe. I would go along with the line that it's just high pressure water being passed through a dirty pipe, but maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you, James. As I say, keen to have you on again soon to talk more about your reflections on being in Russia, the first time for a long time for you. Before we go to everyone's final thoughts, I just want to read another final thought from a listener, Gabriel, in Canada. And this again returns to listeners' memories from the Cold War. He writes, "Following your episodes referencing Radio Free Europe and being from the French part of Canada, I decided to ask my date, a German-Canadian raised girl, about the history of her parents escaping from the Iron Curtain." That's one way of starting a date, Gabriel, blimey. "They grew up in the 70s in Eastern Germany. To my surprise, I didn't mention Radio Free Europe, but it was almost the first thing that she mentioned. She first said that her father told her he would listen to the radio trying to figure out which country was the easiest to escape from. She then told me her father actually stole a motorbike whilst being shot at by a Soviet soldier and escaped through Czechoslovakia. She went through the details of him closing his eyes when he saw the border and praying that they would miss him before he crossed, since he knew he wouldn't get shot the second that he'd crossed that line. She also told me that her mother got arrested by the Secret Service, and Radio Free Europe was an inspiration to her not to give up. As a French Canadian that was born after the fall of the Iron Curtain, I'd heard of that service, but not how important it was. Thank you for that information and for shedding light on the silencing of freedom. Well, thank you very much for writing in, Gabriel, and to everybody who continues to write in. Do keep doing so. This podcast is a historical record, not only of the war in Ukraine, but also of the wider historical events that preceded it. So thank you for continuing to do that. I personally find it so fascinating. I could read them all day. As we always say, we read every message. Let's go now to Nate. Nate, where do you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I actually want to not talk about Georgia, but instead to mention this amazing building in Kharkiv, the Derzhprom, that was struck and partially damaged by a Russian attack last night. It's a historical building in this very unique constructivist style. One of the most famous buildings in the country, and I think it's a bit unclear at the moment how much it was damaged, but it's just yet another sign of the extent that the full-scale war is causing to the country. I mean, not just in terms of people, but in culture and architecture and countless other ways.
James Rothwell.
And my final thought with a sort of addendum to the developments in German politics over the last few days. Something to keep an eye on is increased talk in Germany on the opposition side, that's the CDU, about giving Putin an ultimatum if they come into power next year. Now, the German elections are in September of next year. A lot could happen before then. But I think it's interesting that the CDU, the main opposition party in Germany, is calling for an ultimatum to be delivered to Putin, which is as follows. If you keep bombing civilian targets in Ukraine, we, the Germans, will deliver Taurus missiles to Ukraine immediately. This was an ultimatum that was suggested by Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU party. It's pretty tough talk from a German politician within the standards of the German debate on Ukraine. And it's a clue that even though those German elections are quite far off, the campaign is very much already underway. And it could lead to quite an interesting shift in stance of Germany towards Ukraine. So I just recommend to our listeners who are interested in that sort of wider European political debate on the war to keep an eye on this character, Friedrich Merz, coming out with some interesting ideas on the war. And as I said, specifically on Taurus missiles, which of course Mr. Scholz is vehemently opposed to sending. So definitely something to keep watching in future.
Well, thank you very much, James. Just since you mentioned Taurus missiles there, it's noteworthy, of course, that South Korea has its own Taurus missiles that it could, in theory, send in response to what's going on with the North Korean forces on European soil and the threats therein for South Korea. But James Kilner, I know you've spoken a lot today. It's been really interesting hearing your perspective. Great to have you back. Where do you want to leave our listeners with?
Just to follow up on the South Korea, North Korea angle, I was reading today on the Russian Telegram channels how the North Korean foreign minister is making his way to Russia. He's left North Korea. He's making his way to Moscow, I think. I think this is significant. We are waiting for the upper house of the Russian parliament to rubber stamp a mutual military assistance deal between Putin and Kim. Essentially green lights the deployment of North Korean soldiers, at least in the Kursk region, where Russia can say it's been invaded by Ukraine. I think it's going to happen soon. I think this visit by the North Korean foreign minister is definitely something worth following. I think we're going to see this rubber stamping very shortly. And then I think we're going to see, unfortunately, these North Korean troops go into action. So that's where I'd like to direct your listeners, Francis. Also, I think my slightly wider story on what it feels like to be in Russia anyway, and how I played chess with an FSB officer in Kazan, etc., will be coming out, if not today, then hopefully tomorrow.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow the Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.